Hello Ice and Fire Nerds, this is Chris, and happy damn New Year. Let's make 2017 a good one. So let's continue our Game of Thrones Foreshadowing series and pick up right where we left off in Season 1, Episode 1, Winter is Coming. In this first scene I want to talk about introduces us to Arya and Sansa as they learn some needleworking skills from Septa Mordain.
As always, well done.
Thank you.
I love the detail that you managed to get in these pictures.
Now right off the bat we can sense some tension between Arya and Sansa. Arya is holding a needle in her hand. Now this is a bit of a stretch, I guess you could say, because everybody's holding needles in their hand, but the point being here that it really focuses on Arya, her, doing her needlework. She can't stand it. She's listening outside, wanting to go play with the boys. And this of course leads to...
This is no toy. First lesson. Sticking with the pointy end.
Sansa can keep her sewing needles. I've got a needle of my own.
She didn't like the first needle she had in the show, but she damn sure liked the second one. Alright, and this next scene, as I mentioned in part 1, it really focuses on Bran in the courtyard here with Jon and Robb as they practice their bow skills.
Girls only want boyfriends who have great skills.
And I was trying to think, Bran misses the target the first time, everybody has a good laugh, and that of course opens the door for Arya to come up and hit the target the second time. Everybody's kind of laughing and joking around, so I'm thinking, what could this possibly mean? He misses the target with the arrow. I'm not really sure if this foreshadows anything, but it damn sure looks a little bit like this.
You can't kill it,
Why not?
Because the raven is you.
So in the original scene, he misses the target in the courtyard at Winterfell, and this payoff scene, if that's what in fact it is, and again, this is a bit of a stretch. We hear from Jojen he can't hit the crow because he is the crow. So just a little bit more evidence to clue us in that Bran's going to be a big-time player in our story. And for a scene I forgot to mention in part 1, we have Jon saying,
Don't look away.
King of the Andals in the first
Father will know if you do.
Now admittedly this is a bit of a stretch as well. George R. R. Martin style, every line means something, and you have to give Dan and Dave a little bit of credit because after all this is a TV show, they have to cut out so much from the books. So I was thinking this may foreshadow what we see in the Tower of Joy.
Father!
When Bran actually looks at his father, watches him, and yells out "Father," and Ned actually looks away from the Tower of Joy. Now again, this is just my opinion. It's a little bit of a stretch admittedly, so if you guys have any other ideas about why Jon would say this to Bran, let me know in the comments below. Alright, so let's jump ahead to something pretty obvious. After Ned beheads Will for deserting the Night's Watch, we see the following.
No mounted lions in these woods.
So we have the obvious here that the stag and direwolf basically killed each other. They were at each other's throats, literally. Now obviously the stag here refers to House Baratheon, specifically Robert, and the direwolf represents Ned, and the Starks for that matter being their house sigils. But what's interesting here is Theon asks Ned right before they find the actual direwolf and the pups,
Mountain lion?
so now of course we have a third sigil come into play, and that is the Lion of Lannisters. Now of course this likely represents the Lannisters as a whole, not necessarily just Joffrey, because Joffrey was in fact a Lannister as we know, although most people thought he was a Baratheon. He was directly responsible for Ned's death, but a lion being Cersei was also responsible for Robert's death. And it kind of foreshadows the fact that Robert and Ned have to go at each other just a little bit, but it's all caused by the Lannisters. So of course this scene leads to
King Robert Baratheon, murdered by a pig.
and the general overall fall of House Stark and House Baratheon. Now this next scene where they find the direwolf and the pups is pretty obvious.
It's a freak. It's a direwolf. There are no direwolves south of the wall. No, there are 5.
They're usually north of the wall, and who else is north of the wall? Bloodraven, aka the Three-Eyed Crow, aka the Three-Eyed Raven, depending on the books or the show. So this tells you that something is off, something is going on. So something sent that direwolf south, and I've said in many videos before, I believe this was Bloodraven directly. He sent this pregnant direwolf with exactly the right amount of pups south of the wall to the Stark children to unlock their warging abilities, specifically for Bran. I mean, Jon even says to Ned,
They were meant to have them.
and what Jon unknowingly means here is Bloodraven meant for you to have these pups. because I need that little crippled ass kid to come up here and take my place. And of course the direwolf pups all represent the Stark children, and I've said before in many videos that I think their names that we find out later represent kind of what's going to happen to the Stark children over time. But we also have another little interesting tidbit here is Jon's direwolf ghost, who is found last, who is the run of the litter. He is automatically set off as being different from the rest, just like Jon is when he tells Bran,
I'm not a Stark.
we learn that Jon is different, something's going on with him. We don't even recognize at this point what's going on as far as bastardy in our story and how bastards are different from everybody else. But Jon's direwolf ghost has white hair and red eyes, kind of like an albino. And for a book shout out here, Bloodraven was actually born as an albino with red eyes, being that he was a green seer. They were either born with red eyes or green eyes in some cases. So this special direwolf that ends up being Ghost, Jon's pup, just so happens to be albino with red eyes, just like Bloodraven, aka Brynden Rivers. And on top of that, it hints a little bit about his actual heritage that we got confirmed in season 6. Because of course he is a Targaryen, and this direwolf Ghost had white hair, very similar to the silverish hair of Targaryens. So right in the beginning of this show, they're telling us that Jon is different, and he's not the same as the rest of the Stark kids. Now, interestingly enough, right after this scene, the first shot of King's Landing, after they show us the outside and label King's Landing Forest, we see this scene here. Now this is a Jon laying here dead after we had just been told basically that something's up with Jon, something's different about him, something special about him, and the first scene in King's Landing is a death scene where somebody's laying on a table dead and his name happens to be Jon. So this obviously leads to so Robb had just told us in the previous scene, this one's yours, Snow. And then of course we cut over to the death scene of Jon Arryn laying on the table. So I believe that kind of foreshadows Jon's death 5 seasons later. Alright, so let's do one more, why not? So we have this scene here. So obviously in the scene, this is pretty self-explanatory. This is the Raven flying into Winterfell, bringing news of Robert riding for Winterfell of Jon Arryn's death. But on a more metaphorical, foreshadowy type level, it looks like this is actually Bloodraven arriving at Winterfell. So this kind of represents Bloodraven coming into Winterfell to start to recruit Bran to come up north of the Wall and replace him as the Three-Eyed Crow. And we have a little bit more evidence of this, that something else is going on here when we see Ned in the Godswood cleaning ice, and Catelyn walks up with the news of the Raven. Ned tells Catelyn, "You're not an outsider," and of course Catelyn replies,
I wonder if the old gods agree.
So when we think about the old gods, as Catelyn mentions here, we're obviously thinking about Bloodraven, the children of the forest. As they're sitting here in front of a weirwood tree, we know that Bloodraven, the Three-Eyed Crow, can see all of this happening. So it's just really interesting here where they bring up the old gods for the first time, kind of letting us know there's different religions in this world. But at the same time, it was right after the scene where the Raven flew up. And of course, later on in our story, we find out what the old gods really mean. What they really mean when people say old gods is probably green seers like Bloodraven in the tree in werewood.net. And of course, he goes on to recruit Bran to get him to come replace him as the Three-Eyed Crow. We're going to start getting into some pretty juicy, cool stuff here. Some of this is pretty self-explanatory, some of it's pretty obvious, and a lot of it's just introductions, but they had deeper meanings, I think, in a lot of these scenes, even though they were just introducing us to all the major characters in the story, especially being episode 1. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think in the comments below. What did I miss? What could that potentially mean when Jon told Bran, "Father is watching," and him missing the target for that matter? And anything you would like to expand on, be sure to do that in the comments below. As usual, guys, thank you for all the support, especially to you guys on Patreon. And as always, a quick shout out to my executive Patreon smokescreen producers, Halls Griffin and Vol Guy 10. Thank you guys so much. Really, really appreciate the support. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.